All right, this is part 4, hopefully the last part of Chapter 19, Audio Lecture Notes. We're going to start with looking at alterations of parathyroid function. If you remember the parathyroid glands, there's 4 of them that sit right behind the thyroid. So with hyperparathyroidism, there can be primary and secondary. Primary hyperparathyroidism is generally caused by an adenoma in one or any of the parathyroid glands. The adenoma itself, it's cancerous tissue, it's not functioning properly, and it is just constantly pumping out PTH. The high levels of PTH will then result in high calcium levels or hypercalcemia. And with the hypercalcemia, you also develop hypophosphatemia. Those two minerals or electrolytes are going to be inversely proportionate. The hypercalcemia acts on kidney function, and it's going to decrease kidney function, and that in turn is going to result or can result in metabolic acidosis, where the pH, the blood pH, is going to decrease into that acidic area, and it's metabolic acidosis because it has nothing to do with the pulmonary system, but rather a metabolic activity, the endocrine activity. Then there is secondary hyperparathyroidism. Secondary hyperparathyroidism may be or is often due to low calcium levels. All right, with low calcium levels, this could be due to kidney disease, and if the body doesn't have proper calcium levels, that is naturally going to stimulate the parathyroid glands to secrete more PTH. All right, so it's secondary. It is secondary because due to some other primary condition. All right, that primary condition is going to be the low levels of calcium. Those low levels of calcium can be because of kidney function, and that is then going to result in a secondary condition of hyperparathyroidism. So, having too much PTH, hyperparathyroidism, that's going to cause excessive osteoclastic and osteolytic activity, which we'll review in the muscular system. That acts on bone to release calcium. All right. That excessive osteoclastic and osteolytic activity results in bone resorption. That can result in fractures, and compression of the spine can be an issue. Chronic hypercalcemia may be associated with kidney stones as well. Calcium is one of the major components of kidney stones. There can be issues in the GI system, and then also muscle weakness. Now, if we move to hypoparathyroidism, right, it's hypo, abnormally low levels of PTH, and in almost all cases, this is going to be due to parathyroid damage when a person has thyroid disease. Thyroid surgery, we'll get to it. 3rd time is the charm. Because of how those glands are situated right on the back of the thyroid, so easy to damage the parathyroid or even just completely take them out when a thyroid is removed. So if you have thyroid issues, the physician, the endocrinologist, is probably going to try to treat it without surgery, first round, to see if they can protect that tissue. Now, what happens with low levels of PTH? You develop hypocalcemia and hyperphosphatemia. Again, you have that inverse relationship. The ability to resorb calcium from bone and to regulate calcium resorption from the kidneys is impaired. So, Hypocalcemia lowers the threshold for nerve and muscle excitation. And so you can develop muscle spasms, hyperreflexia, seizures, and in very rare cases, you can actually have death. So one important thing to remember from this slide is the inverse relationship between hypocalcemia and hyperphosphatemia. All right, now adrenal functions, looking specifically at the adrenal cortex. Couple of different diseases. You have Cushing disease and then Cushing syndrome. These kind of run together in terms of what you might see with clinical manifestations, but the different disease versus syndrome is going to be why it develops or how it develops. So with Cushing disease, you would have excessive anterior pituitary secretion of ACTH. All right, the ACTH levels are generally due to adenomas, and this is pituitary dependent. All right, so ACTH is going to cause an increase in cortisol secretion, just like you have down here, but it's because the pituitary is secreting high levels of ACTH. With Cushing syndrome, you have excessive levels of cortisol, regardless of the cause. And this is going to be pituitary independent, and this could be a cancer of the adrenal cortex itself, right? An adenoma here, where the adrenal cortex is constantly going to be producing high levels of cortisol. So the high levels of cortisol are pituitary independent, whereas Cushing disease, it's pituitary dependent because the pituitary is secreting high levels of ACTH, which then go and act on the adrenal cortex to cause high levels of cortisol. All right, so clinical manifestations of either Cushing disease or Cushing syndrome. All right, sometimes it's simply referred to as Cushing. Instead of actually saying Cushing disease or Cushing syndrome. And you got the notes in this page, but I'll just move to this picture here. There can be weight gain, and usually where you see that weight gain is going to be in the face. So here's a picture of a young boy. This is prior to his issue developing, whether it's disease or syndrome, but then this is after the fact, and you can see a very vast difference between the two pictures. All right, so increase in weight, but generally it's going to be in the face, and it's also going to be truncal, right? Truncal obesity, weight gained right in the gut. And there's glucose intolerance, and so that can lead to a person developing diabetes. There can be issues with acne, increase in body hair, all over, increase in facial hair, and there is thinning of the scalp, hair itself. A person can bruise easily, and what happens is a person, all right, just because of the high levels of cortisol, all right, there's the accumulation of adipose tissue, but there's also muscle wasting, and so this person can develop weight gain in the face or the trunk, in the stomach area, but then have very skinny limbs, whether it be very thin legs, thin arms, and in some cases with women, they can have so much weight gain right here in the belly that the person may be incorrectly accused of being pregnant. There's a loss of protein, or there's protein metabolism issues, and that can lead to osteoporosis. It can lead to loss of collagen in the skin, which therefore you have very thin skin. You can bruise easily. You've got this purple stria that can develop. And the way to correct this is simply to figure out what is going on and try to correct that, right? Whether it is a tumor that can be surgically removed or altered with different medications. All right, here's another example of that truncal obesity here. All right, you can see rather thin legs here relative to the belly. All right, so this is before treatment, and then this is after treatment. And what you can see is that this weight gain here in the belly is gone, or a good portion of it is gone, and this woman looks more proportionate in terms of the level of adipose tissue you see in the belly relative to the thighs here. All right, so then looking at the hyperaldosteronism. All right, two diseases can develop here. You can have primary hyperaldosteronism, which is called Cone disease or cone disease. All right, this is excessive secretion of aldosterone from an abnormality of the adrenal cortex. Again, usually an adenoma. You guys are hearing me say adenoma quite often. You might want to know that in terms of what type of cancer that is. It's a cancer of the endocrine tissue. So you have chronic increased levels of aldosterone that results in fluid and electrolyte imbalances. You have increased renal resorption of water and sodium, results in hypervolemia, that results in hypertension, and renal secretion of potassium. So the clinical manifestations of this: hypervolemia, hypertension, hypokalemia. And if you go back to chapter 5, you can look at the clinical manifestations of hypokalemia. All right, then the last disease here on this slide is Addison's disease, primary adrenal insufficiency. So here the adrenal cortex can be destroyed generally by autoantibodies, right? Similar to the thyroid with Graves' disease, how autoantibodies go and attack that tissue. In here, or in this case with Addison's disease, the antibodies attack the tissue, there's inflammation, and then that tissue is actually destroyed. So then you result in inadequate production of the corticosteroid and mineralocorticoids. ACTH levels are high because the pituitary is thinking it still needs to pump out that ACTH to try to stimulate the adrenal cortex, but nothing's happening. So clinical manifestations: weakness, easily fatigued, skin changes, hyperpigmentation specifically, and eventually there will be GI issues, vomiting, cramping, diarrhea, and ultimately the development of hypotension. That can result in heart arrhythmias, decreased cardiac output, and all of those combined could potentially end up with a coma or death, or a coma and then death. All right, then also a couple of other issues of the adrenal cortex. There can be hypersecretion of the adrenal androgens and estrogens. Those are going to result in feminization and virilization. All right, so feminization, hypersecretion of estrogens. Typically, where you're going to see this issue is going to be in the male, and the male becomes more feminine-like. Virilization, hypersecretion of the androgens, and you're going to see this in the female taking on more masculine characteristics. All right, so here you see this is, by just looking at the face, should be a female. All right, but she has gone through the process of virilization, or her body is doing this, right? Not intentionally, but she is becoming more masculine. Her overall physical characteristics: she's got very wide shoulders, increase in muscle mass, All right, she doesn't have any curves really to her. She has decreased breast tissue.